Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, a.k.a. Caliban, and if you think Voyager wastes too much time on side quests, just wait till they're haggling with the Borg over vacuum tubes for Tom's TV. I'm joined on this episode once again by James Swallow. James is the New York Times and Sunday Times best-selling author of numerous novels, short stories, audio dramas, and video games set in a variety of fictional universes, including Warhammer 40K, Deus Ex, Doctor Who, Stargate, and Blake 7. His latest novel, The Dark Veil, follows the adventures of Captain Riker and the USS Titan in the years before Star Trek Picard, and is available now. James, welcome back to the show.
It's lovely to be here, Aaron. Thank you again for inviting me back.
It's great to have you back aboard. Today we'll be talking about Memorial, the 14th episode of the 6th season of Star Trek Voyager. Starfleet's mission is to not only seek out new life and new civilizations, but to interface with and educate themselves about the cultures that they encounter. Space is big, though, really big, and sometimes those cultures have ceased to exist before the encounter occurs. The Federation's desire to respect all beings extends to that people's funerary traditions. But at what point does a dead culture become an object of study and something you can no longer interact with? And what if that alien culture, despite its demise, continues to demand that its sins be heard? But we'll talk about that a little later in the show. First, James, it's great to have you here again. It's been a while since we've spoke. And at that time, the release of Shadow, your fourth Mark Dane novel, was imminent. Now it's 2021, and your fifth Dane book, Rogue, is already in the rearview mirror, having released last year. Is this it for Mark Dane, or can we expect to see more adventures with him?
Oh, I'm definitely not done with Mark. Right now, the Shadow is going to be released in the United States, I think, in a couple of months' time, in a hardback edition for Forge Books there. And Rogue is coming out in paperback in the summer. We've just moved the schedule back a little bit to kind of move things around to accommodate what with COVID and lockdown and everything. But the sixth book in the Mark Dane series, which we haven't released the title of yet, I am just in the middle of doing final edits on that, and that should be coming out towards the end of this year.
That is awesome to hear. I should mention as well that Rogue was a #1 bestseller on Amazon last year, so congratulations there.
Thank you.
Have you thought about adapting the Dane stories to another medium like TV or video games or comics?
You know, we have had some conversations about that. I was having a very interesting conversation with a film production company just in the run-up before COVID, and it's like everything else kind of has put the brakes on that. You know, so
pause. Yep.
Yeah, so you know, it's kind of like everything's been in a holding pattern for the last kind of year and a half. It's interesting to have that discussion and see people kind of throwing out names, going, "Oh, would you like this director attached? Would you like this actor attached?" And I'm like, really? Seriously? Is this really a thing? And people just kind of toss this stuff around, and I think that can't be real. You can't really be serious about that guy, really?
Sure.
No, sure not. But you know, it's like all these sort of things. It's kind of fairy gold, right? It's fun to hear these people talk about it, but it's not really there. It's not really real until someone commits to it. You know, so. Right now, it's kind of fantasy casting, fantasy directors, and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's just sort of like, you know, going on IMDb and picking a bunch of actors, going, yeah, that guy'd be fine, that'd be awesome. You know?
Yeah, right. It's like those Wizard magazine in the old days did those fan casting.
Oh yeah, absolutely like that.
We want this guy and that guy. Your budget would be $400 million just for talent, but yeah.
It's totally true, you know. So at the moment, everything's kind of up in the air. It is definitely something I would like to do. I think I'd want a pretty good degree of control on it, though. I mean, very early on, when my first Mark Dane novel, Nomad, came out in 2016, very early on, we had some initial interest from a company that wanted to do a kind of Netflix-style limited series show.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we're going to write you a big check, and then you can just go away and never come back. And I said, that's not what I'm going to do with this. Yeah. You know, I care about this. It's like, no, I don't think so. You know, well, not unless you maybe back up a truck full of money to my house, and then we could have that conversation. But sure. You know, I care a great deal about the Mark Dane series, and you know, I want to be fully involved with it at any stage. So we'll see how it goes. To circle back to your actual question, yes, I would love to do that. But with these kind of things is what I've learned from years of working in this industry and having friends and colleagues who've gone through similar processes is that until you actually see the thing on the screen, it's just not done. It's just not real. So I'm concentrating on the bit that I can control, which is just writing the books.
Yeah. Once you're watching the credits roll, you know that it was real. Yeah.
Yeah.
Last time you were on the show, we talked about how writing espionage novels set in the modern era, that is, in our post-9/11 political climate, is different from a Cold War setting. In the Cold War, it's always assumed that the adversary is the Russians or their proxies, but it isn't long after World War II that spy fiction authors start introducing third-party antagonists. Schmersh is the villain in many of the Bond novels, which were written in the 50s, but by the time the movies come along in the 60s, we've got Spectre, who are a self-serving terrorist organization. And by the 80s, even Tom Clancy and John le Carré were moving on to drug lords and terrorists. It seems like the Cold War period still holds a lot of fascination for audiences and storytellers, but even during the Cold War, writers seem to be looking for ways to write about other things.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny to talk about Cold War now because we are really and truly we're doing Cold War 2.0 now. But the battlefield is very different, and the threat space and the threat actors out there are some of them are the same, but they're kind of like configured in a different way. Russia, China, North Korea are all sort of serious threats, but a lot of that stuff is now happening in the cyber theater rather than just people shooting each other dead in dark alleys. That stuff is still happening, but there's also this kind of this shadow world now of the cyber realm where all that kind of more dangerous, more scary stuff is happening. And it's also the kind of threat that trickles down to the lives of ordinary people like us. Every time you get an email from somebody saying, oh, I've hacked your credit card details, they're using the same kind of software that a nation state actor might use to hack the details of somebody working on a missile test program.
Yeah. And you don't have to go to an enemy country and plan a bomb to blow something up. Now you can get on the computer and, ruin their water processing plant, or affect their nuclear power plants or something like that.
That's right. It's funny being a thriller writer. You're absolutely right about what you said earlier about this kind of phase state change where it used to be the Russians were the bad guys. First it was the Germans, then it was the Russians, then it was China, and then we reached that stage where it's okay. We're it's glasnost, perestroika. It's like, oh, the Russians might be our friends now, and suddenly the threat actors became kind of evil corporations, or you see terrorist groups. Or you look at some of the sort of, there's that kind of period in techno thrillers where you can see authors struggling to find a bad guy. And you'd see stuff like, suddenly Germany has resurged and decided been taken over by the far right. Germany is now going to take over Europe, and that's going to be the plot of this novel, which kind of, you look at that and think, that doesn't feel that realistic. Or you'd see like a coalition of smaller groups teaming up to fight kind of the superpowers. Yeah. And that sort of flailing around to find ideas. And I think that's kind of the reason why we saw for a while kind of drop off in techno thriller storytelling and the rise of stuff like the kind of Dan Brown style of thriller, where you have a more of a mythological kind of basis, and we for a while that was kind of the big thing, the sort of the airport novel, the beach read. But I think the pendulum is kind of swinging back the other way now, because in the real world, terrorist threats and that sort of thing, that still is a very realistic thing. But the idea of nation state warfare, this Cold War 2.0 is kind of becoming a bit more resurgent now. And I think techno thriller writers like me are looking at that and going, well, this is great grist for the mill, because this gives us an interesting adversary for our heroes to fight against.
Yeah, I think people scoffed when in the late 90s, Jonathan Pryce was the villain of Tomorrow Never Dies, and he wanted to get publishing rights in China or something like that. And then, of course, 25 years later, we're literally facing the possible topple of states over media control. So it's, the circles of relevance kind of come back.
Terribly prescient when you go back and look at that movie and you think, it would seem like, how could a newspaper guy, kind of foment a war between two nation states? Well, actually, not as crazy as you might think.
I'm going to team up with a Chinese agent to stop a media magnet from destroying the world. Yeah, it seems very, very modern.
Very much so.
I can't remember if I asked you before, but let's say you get a call from Penguin Random House. We need a new author for the James Bond novels. Do you take the job?
Man, I mean, of course I'd say yes. I mean, I'd be crazy, right?
Sure.
But wow, I mean, what a poison chalice, right? I mean, it's the burden on you the burden of expectation would be astronomical.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't not take it. My father's ghost stalked me down the street saying, "You fool! Why haven't you done this?" Because those movies were like mother's milk to me. Is this kind of stuff that I was raised on. So absolutely,
sure.
I would take it, but it would be, wow, what a challenge! It would be so hard to do it well, because Bond has been so heavily mined by different authors and in film and in prose, I'd relish it, whether I'd be able to kind of land it at the end of the day, well, that's another question. But
Sure.
I would definitely kind of grab on to that with both hands. I think if I ever got that opportunity, I would like to write a Bond novel set in the present day as well, because I think in recent years the Bond books have kind of gone back a little bit into the sort of classic Fleming era, in the sort of 60s, what have you, 50s and 60s, and as great as those books are, I don't think I would be equipped to tell that kind of story in that era well. I'd go back to what feels kind of closer to me. Maybe if I did write in a different time period, I'd maybe pick the 80s or the 90s, but I would bring it closer to the present day, because I'm fascinated by the technology of modern espionage as much as I am sort of by the old kind of stuff of dead drops and Morse code and what have you like that. I like the synergy of the two things is fascinating to me.
What about another medium like Warren Ellis's work in the comics or maybe for a video game?
Well, that'd be interesting. Yeah, we do have a new Bond video game actually on the way from the people who brought us the Hitman games, IO Interactive.
Yeah, right.
And I can't wait to play that. I've got to say, I love the Hitman games. I think they're going to do a fantastic job with it.
Yeah, I wonder if James Bond will be dressing up like waiters and things like that.
Yeah, and as for the comic books, of course, Dynamite Comics recently have been doing a lot of James Bond comic books, and they've been exploring the character in interesting ways. And I think that would be a fascinating approach to take, because different medium, means you kind of exercise different muscles as a writer, and comic books lend themselves well to kind of big action adventure, brassy sort of widescreen kind of storytelling, and I think Bond plays very well to that. Certainly the movie version does.
Speaking of Penguin Random House, it was announced late last year that Simon & Schuster had been acquired by Penguin, making the Big Five, the Big Four, and you've been writing for a long time and for a lot of different publishers. How do you see that affecting the industry?
I don't know. I'm quite cautious about it, I have to be honest, because whenever there's less publishers, however you want to slice it, that's not a good thing, because it reduces the number of options for people to tell their stories. And if there's less publishers, it means there are less authors getting an opportunity to get their work seen. It means the market becomes more conservative and it picks safer options. And that kind of fools new voices. So on that side of things, I am kind of a little bit disquieted by it. I would like to see a larger, more diverse kind of publishing industry out there. I think that deal hasn't even been ratified fully yet. So, there's still a chance it may not even go ahead,
Yeah.
But, I think it's a difficult line to walk, because every time something like that happens, there's an acquisition takes place. Immediately, there's a bloodbath of projects that get killed for various different reasons, because some people decide to leave because they don't like the new management, or new people come in, things change around, And I've had friends who have worked for publishers that have been, absorbed by another publisher, and their trilogy of books is suddenly killed stone dead at book 2, and the third book never comes out, and that kind of thing. So it can be, the authors are at the sharp end of these things, and it can be really sort of problematic. I think, but at this stage, it's too early to tell. The publishing industry is like a super tanker, moves very, very slow, takes ages to turn around. So even if this does go ahead, it's going to be a couple of years before you even see in the marketplace how that decision has affected things. 2 years from now, you'll see what books aren't coming out or what books aren't coming out, and it'll be like, oh, okay, these are the changes that were made. But right now, it's kind of too early to tell.
We also discussed last time you were on the show espionage, the idea of it as we see it on screen in Star Trek, which is to say not often, but mostly in the form of Section 31. And Section 31 as an entity has been employed quite a bit in the new Trek shows. And of course, we've got the Philippa Georgiou show in development. They've been involved in a lot of questionable ethical skullduggery in Trek in their history. But do you think there's room for a kindler, gentler Section 31 series?
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I think what we're talking about here is like, let's do spies in Star Trek, right? And that in itself is a cool idea. But whether Section 31 is that idea, I think that's a different conversation, because the idea of a Starfleet intelligence show, a kind of something that it could be like, Star Trek does SEAL Team, or it could be Star Trek does kind of like MI5. It could be anything like that. It could be people in corridors of power, like dealing with stuff, or it could be secret agents undercover and what have you. That's an interesting idea. But the thing is Section 31 has always been characterized as the bad guys.
Really bad, yeah.
So really bad, right? So how do we redeem that? If that's going to be your focal point, I mean, is that what the story's about? I mean, and that could be interesting. Is it a story about how someone tries to bring Section 31 back to the light and try and make them an organization for good? That could be an interesting way to explore this narrative. Is it, the good people working for a bad organization? And we've seen that kind of stuff. I mean, if you remember the TV show Alias, had the central conceit of that was a woman who's a secret agent who thinks she's working for the CIA, and she discovers that she's actually working for a group of bad guys.
Yeah.
And that's a really cool idea, that kind of double bluff. And that feels very much like a kind of spy movie kind of move, right? Yeah. Playing out something like that in Star Trek would be interesting. But I think that they've got a hard road to go to make Section 31 feel like a sympathetic organization.
Yeah, I think they really do. You've got a line of successful spy novels, and you've written over a dozen Trek books, so they'd be fools not to get your input on a Section 31 series.
Oh, that would be lovely. But, it's the door does swing both ways these days with the TV shows, and we do get kind of an opportunity to talk back to some of the people working on the shows. But whether any of us book writers would get to kind of cross over, well, I would absolutely love that. So, Mr. Kurtzman, if you're listening, call me. But
I'll get you in touch with him.
But I'm not holding my breath on that one.
Well, speaking of holding your breath, that's a good transition. How have you been holding up in the time of COVID-19?
Well, it's been pretty crazy, I think, for everybody. I think we're all in the same sort of situation. We all feel like we've got kind of cabin fever. It is like kind of being under house arrest. But as I've said to a lot of my friends, being a writer, a full-time professional writer, I have an office in my house. I work from home, and I've been doing that for several years. So when my friends say to me, like, it's crazy working from home, I'm, well, welcome to my life. This is what it's like being a jobbing author, except with less ability to kind of go out and socialize. So I think I adjusted pretty well. My wife, she works for a local council here in the UK, and she's had to transit to working from home. So we turned one of the rooms into the house into an office for her. And nice. I think it was helpful, actually, that she had me around, because I gave her a few hints and tips. It's like, this is how to do working from home without going crazy.
Right, yeah.
Hydrate a lot, take breaks, and just, focus on your mental well-being.
Well, the episode that we're talking about today is, I think, a very strong episode of Voyager, and it's one that you have a connection to, as it's based on an original story idea by you. And the last time that we were on, you shared the story of how you got the news that they were buying your idea for the episode, A Call from Brannon Braga, and how exciting it was. Conversely, I heard you say in an interview recently that when you sold your first idea to Trek, the story that would become the episode 1, that you thought that you'd be jumping for joy, but instead you just felt numb at the time. Was that shock?
Yeah, I think it was. It was. People have often said that selling a pitch is kind of it's the nerd equivalent of winning the lottery, right? And
yeah, sure, yeah.
And it really was, and I got to do it twice, right? Which is lucky me. But I do remember it was Lolita Farjo, who was a script coordinator on the show, and by the time I'd made the sale, she'd become a personal friend of mine. And I remember she called me and she said, I'd specifically asked permission to call you because as a friend, I wanted to be the one to break the news to you. Guess what? You made a sale. And I can remember just being sort of spaced out by the whole, is this really actually happening kind of experience?
Sure.
After all I've been doing this for so long, and it seemed like such a kind of pipe dream, such an impossible challenge that I was throwing myself at it. I think maybe on some level I never thought I was going to do it, and then suddenly I did, and I was like, oh wow, you did it, and I kind of didn't know where to go, and I was really quite stunned by the whole thing. And I can remember after the conversation, it was kind of a couple of hours later when I kind of caught up with it, and it was like, holy shit, what have I done? And then kind of like, and then that was the sort of like the wave of it just kind of hit me as I realized the ramifications of that I'd done something that was literally going to change my career, and it did.
Yeah.
And, that put me on a course that has led me to the career I have now.
That's awesome. Ideas go through, obviously a lot of rewriting before they hit the small screen. And I'm sure the same is true of your idea. Do you remember your original pitch for Memorial?
Yeah, the story was originally called A Memory of Wartime, and the thing about that is I remember that story distinctly because each of the stories I pitched has like kind of a distinct sort of place in my mind. One was very important to me because it was the first sale I ever made, and to me that was like, wow, you've done this, you popped your cherry, you are a professional writer now, you've done a professional thing. But immediately after that, I was consumed by this feeling that, I have to do this again. I have to do it a second time because I don't want to be thought of as this kind of a tourist, a one-hit wonder.
Yeah.
And I thought I'd be doomed to have people say, well, you just got lucky. That's why you made the sale. You don't, it wasn't talent. You just got lucky. And I thought I need to do this again to prove to myself that that's not true, that I did this because I was good enough. And so, if anything, I felt like I worked even harder to try and make a second. And what I would do with these pitches is that sometimes I would do them over the telephone, or I would, travel over to the studios and I would do them in person. And I can remember the day I pitched this story is I'd worked in the week running up to my trip to LA. I'd worked on all these story ideas and I do kind of like a 500-word, like one-page document that would all the beats of the story, nail it all down. And then the night before I would go to do the pitch meeting, I would get a bunch of index cards and I would just write bullet points down on the index cards, kind of to refresh my memory and remind myself what I was doing. And in the taxi cab on the way to the Paramount lot, I'm looking at these cards, and I literally had an idea in the cab on the way there. I thought, hey, you know what would happen if this? And I just jotted it down on the back of one of the cards. And I thought no more of it. And I went in to pitch to Brian Fuller, who's a great guy, taught me a lot about writing, and a really, really talented writer and a great story editor, and a lot of fun to just talk about Star Trek with. And I sat in his office and I pitched him these ideas, and he shot down every single one after the other. And at the end of it, I was like, what have I done? I've traveled halfway around the world to pitch all these ideas, and just every single one of them has just crashed and burned. And you can imagine how I felt at that point. What's gonna happen now is I'm gonna pick up my stuff, get in my cab, go back to my hotel, and drink a bowl of scotch or something, because
right. Yeah.
and wait for my flight to go home, right? And it was like, this trip is 100% a failure. And Brian must have seen the look on my face, and he said to me, "Have you got anything else?" And I said, "Well, there's this one thing I just wrote. It's like 2 or 3 lines. I wrote this down in the back of the taxi, and this is the idea." Yeah. And the idea was the Voyager crew have a flashback from being involved in this terrible war, but they were never there. And they're living somebody else's memory. And I just saw a light go on in his head. And he's like, that's really good. And he's like, well, what if we did this? And then suddenly it stopped being a conversation where I was pitching an idea to him, and it became a conversation where we were breaking a story.
Sure.
And his energy just kind of infected me. And I said, okay, well, if we do this, we do this. And then we just kind of, we threw around a bunch of ideas. And the meeting kind of ran way longer than it was supposed to. And at the end of it, Brian went, "This is good. I'm going to take it upstairs. This is good stuff." And that was it. And it was just this random magic moment. Had I just picked up my stuff and walked out the door, had he not asked me, I wouldn't have made that second sale.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing, that kind of razor's edge, by the way, that, success comes or goes. And as I said, after that, the story was picked up. It was Brandon Braga developed the story past that point, and he and I worked together on kind of breaking that story over a couple of phone meetings. And then it was, I believe, Robin Berger who wrote the final version of the script.
Right.
And the story just kind of expanded and exploded from there. But it's kind of amazing to me how, this chance collection of possibilities just happened to all come together in the right moment for me to sell a story idea.
There isn't always a reason why they reject your ideas, or a good reason. But did you get any feedback about why all those things you prepared were not right for the show?
Oh yeah, I mean, that was one thing that I found really, really useful working on, especially when I was pitching for Voyager, was that all of the writers I worked with, as Brian Fuller was there, Joe Manovsky, Raf Green, Brandon as well. All of the writers that I worked with in various ways, pitching and just discussing story ideas, were all so generous about how the story idea would work. And it wouldn't be kind of like, that's no good, next. It would be, that's no good because we're doing this. It's, oh, that's a great idea, but you know what? We're shooting that episode right now. Or, We can't do that because we have different plans for these characters. So every time I went away, I had a better idea of what I was doing wrong. I felt like it's like throwing darts at a dartboard blindfolded, right? And after a while, you kind of go, just if I go a little bit left, I'm getting closer and closer to the bullseye.
Right.
And, and I didn't feel like I was kind of throwing stuff blindfolded. After a while, I felt like I was just like, telepathically going, this is where the center is. Thud, right, there we go. I've got it this time, and that was it.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it was crazy. I remember after Voyager finished, I also went on to pitch for Enterprise. Unfortunately, wasn't as successful with that. But I can remember distinctly pitching an episode of Enterprise. And I think it was Raf Green I was pitching to, and he just laughed his head off. He said, "We're shooting that episode right now."
Oh, well.
And I was like, "What?" And I pitched this idea. I said, I want to do Apollo 13. I want to do an Apollo 13 sort of pastiche. And I said, and it's Reed and Trip Tucker trapped in a shuttlecraft, and it's like Apollo 13. And he started laughing. I'm like, "Why is that funny?" He's like, "Because we're doing this episode called Shuttle Pod 1 right now."
Yeah.
And it was just, I was like, have you got telepaths working there? Did you pluck this idea from my brain? And it was just a coincidence that these things came together. Is that sometimes with a limited sort of palette of ideas and possibilities, you're going to pitch stuff that is kind of the same, So it was crazy. But in a way, I was very heartened by that, because I said, well, that means I'm almost in the right spot. Because if I'm pitching you a story that you bought from somebody else like a month ago, the next story I'll pitch you might be the one that you buy from me.
Right, if I can get it in, on time.
Yeah.
I wonder, too, if the specificity of the setting and the time period would lead to, Star Trek fans and writers thinking, oh, well, if they're in the 22nd century, then they're going to have to do this. They're going to have to do this. I pointed out, I think, in our last talk that both One and Memorial are darker stories, and they both feature the crew experiencing delusions and questioning what's real and what isn't. And in this episode, Janeway brings up herself the fact that this isn't the first time that they've had their minds screwed with and rewritten. And it occurred to me that that's a recurring trope for a Voyager story. And I was trying to think about like other Voyager stories. Like, what do you think makes a Voyager episode specifically, or at least what ideas were you thinking about when you were pitching for Voyager?
Well, I go for kind of not just specifically like a Voyager story, but like on a wider sort of track of what I think the first question is, what makes this a Star Trek story?
Yeah.
And then, you kind of, that's the first filter you go through. Does this feel like Star Trek? And there's like, now, does this feel like a Voyager story, or would it, a Voyager story has a different tonality to a TNG story, to a DS9 story, to Enterprise, Lower Decks, Discovery, what have you. Each show's got its unique character.
Yeah.
I think with Voyager stories, there was always a kind of sense of wonder and a sense of discovery going on in the narrative. Is that often you would see our characters encounter a problem, and it might be a threat, or it might be something they don't understand. It might be somebody who dupes them into believing something because that person wants something from them. Our characters find out, and then the next act is the characters find out what's really going on, and the kind of stakes are raised. And in the last act of the story, there's a resolution and a kind of, okay, now we've figured out exactly what's happening, or we've solved the problem, or we've got out of this trap, and we move on, because it's Voyager's a road movie story, right? It's like, it's an ongoing story. It's like, it's like The Incredible Hulk or The Littlest Hobo, right? It's those shows where, our characters are carrying on through the story, and they stop somewhere, they help somebody with a problem, or they solve a problem of their own, and then they move on to the next place. So there has to be there has to be a sense of kind of forward momentum in the Voyager story. I think is a key thing to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, let's talk about the episode. Of course, we're talking about Memorial. It's the 14th episode of the 6th season. It first aired on February 2nd of the year 2000, and the teleplay was by Robin Berger, who was a staff writer on Voyager's 6th season. She also wrote the episodes Fairhaven and Live Fast and Prosper for Voyager's 6th season. Prior to her work on Voyager, she wrote the 3rd season TNG episode The Hunted. She was also a writer and producer on Quantum Leap, and she wrote several episodes of Earth Final Conflict, and she was a writer and story consultant for shows in the 80s and the 90s like MacGyver, Matlock, and Renegade. The story for the episode was by Brandon Braga, who was, of course, an executive producer and writer for the series, and, of course, from an original idea by James Swallow. Directed by Alan Croker, a very prolific director for the Trek franchise, he directed 38 episodes in total, including the series finales of DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise. He's directed for a number of other series since his TV career began in the 80s, such as the Battlestar Galactica reboot, Firefly, Supernatural, and Chuck. We are not given a star date for this episode, and your assignment, James, if you can, is to give us a 25-word synopsis of Memorial.
So essentially, the core concept of the story is the Voyager crew are suffering from traumatic flashbacks of being in a war, but it's a war that they were never in. It's a battle they've never fought, and they have to discover what the source of these memories are and solve that problem.
That sounds great. I'll take it. We'll write that up. Here's some interesting facts from the memory banks about this episode, and they're mostly about TV, to be honest. Paris remarks that TVs in the 50s did not have remote controls, but he's not quite right. The Zenith company developed a TV remote called the Lazy Bones in 1950, though it was connected to the set by a wire. And Zenith tried again in 1956 with the Zenith Space Command, which was a wireless remote that relied on ultrasonic harmonics to signal changes in the set. The sounds that it made led to it being nicknamed the Clicker, and the name stuck. Remotes would become more widespread during the 60s as transistors became more affordable. The programs that we see on Tom's TV set include a 1939 Merry Melodies cartoon, Daffy Duck and the Dinosaur, and an episode of The Untouchables, a show produced by Desilu Studios, which was subsequently purchased by Paramount, which explains its inclusion here. And this is the first episode of Star Trek to feature hockey. Paris would later program a hockey scenario for the holodeck, referred to in subsequent episodes. And I always find it interesting when they make characters on Trek sports fans. There's always a question of whether a certain sport has survived to the 24th century or not. For example, Zisco is a baseball fan, but baseball is basically dead in the 24th century. And O'Brien and Bashir square off in racquetball, but the court is radically different in the 24th century to how it is seen in the 21st century. And you get other mentions to things, but I always wonder if a certain Star Trek character is going to be a football fan or an American football fan or what have you.
Well, we've certainly seen in Picard, we saw Cristobal Rios being a soccer football player.
Right.
Which is kind of cool. I mean, speaking as somebody who is a hockey fan, I'm pleased to see that Tom is kind of like, flying the flag for that. But I have to say, I was a little bit surprised considering, let's say, hockey's not the most gentle of
right.
sports.
Yeah.
And in the kind of enlightened future of Star Trek, I was quite surprised that they would have a game where, you could potentially be in the audience screaming, "Hack the bone!"
Yeah, right.
It doesn't start. I think, really, is it a kind of gentler version of hockey that they play in the future? I don't know.
We always hear about the brutality of pre-season squares, but we never see the game played. And so I wonder if, being a 3-time Academy champion, that's why Harry Kim would get into hockey with Tom.
I've got to think, God, can you imagine Nausicaans or Klingons playing ice hockey? That would be challenging.
You need different weight classes, I think, for hockey in that case. Yeah,
because I can imagine a bunch of Klingons turning up at the Saddle Dome in Calgary or somewhere like that and just absolutely loving every minute of it, right?
Yeah. I don't think we get an idea about whether hockey is like an active and a live sport in the future, but Tom certainly does love it, and it's great to hear that you're a fan of hockey, being somebody from the UK. I don't really know where Tom is from. I think Jerry Taylor pins his birthplace as California in her books or novels. But of course, being the son of a Starfleet captain and later admiral, he probably traveled around a lot. But it's interesting to think how in the future that kind of regionality wouldn't necessarily apply to people's love of things. I mean, even just satellite TV and the internet has created a lot of soccer or football fans in America and around the world.
You'd have to. I mean, we see in terms of baseball teams, we see, was it the Pike City Pioneers? I think was on the on the planet from the planet Cestus 3, right? So would it be? You'd have planet side teams rather than teams that would be based in a particular city. Yeah,
just people picking up sports, alien sports, sports from other cultures or other colonies. Of course, that doesn't explain why baseball's dead. I know Michael Piller loves baseball, but he kills it in his first script for the show. So I don't know.
It's interesting to me though that the kind of Cisco brings it back almost as, because we're living in an era where baseball is still a living, breathing sport. But from his point of view, it's this, it's like somebody getting into kind of medieval chamber music.
Sure. And,
bringing something back to life that hasn't been like a thing for a very long time.
Yeah, there's a nostalgic sort of element to it. But hopefully, with the with the death of the emissary, perhaps baseball has become widespread among the Federation. We don't know.
I kind of like the idea that Cisco, as the emissary on Bajor, maybe reintroduced baseball to Bajorans.
Oh, it's like primarily a Bajoran activity. Yeah, that's interesting.
You can imagine that they were kind of like, well, if the emissary thinks this is cool, maybe we should.
It's part of our culture. Yeah. Well, let's talk about the guest stars in the episode. There's really only one. L.L. Ginter appears as Savdra, and Ginter has been making appearances in film and television since the early 90s. He's also appeared in the films Pearl Harbor, Argo, Beverly Hills Cop 3, and Gattaca, presumably as a tough guy like he is in this episode. We've talked previously about what makes a Voyager episode, and I guess I don't know the exact formula, but it probably involves mind melds, photon torpedoes, black coffee, and at least one perpetual ensign. You mentioned before the idea of solving a mystery and it being sort of a road movie. But I feel like this type of episode, one in which our crew arrives much too late to affect an event or a tragedy, I feel like that idea gets done at least twice that I can think of, with both Memorial and the third season episode Remember specifically, which is also an excellent episode. And I was thinking that there's more than a few episodes of Voyager where there is some sort of tragedy or injustice, and there's really nothing that they can do about it. The crew has to learn about it and kind of soldier on, or just mourn what happened. The death of the Silverblood crew, the death of Harry Kim and the other Voyager, Caretaker, Distant Origin, Jetrel, One Small Step. Voyager often seems to be there just to acknowledge that something has happened, and then they have to hit the road again.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very true. But I think there's also, you have to consider that it's the observer effect of these events, right? Is that our heroes are changed by the fact that they participate in these events, even if it is just as kind of an observer, as someone who is, to pardon the pun, memorializing an event that's taken place. Being involved in that is something that will change you personally. So I think it's like, we have these external events that have taken place. Our heroes can't change anything, but we see how the perception of those events change them as people moving forward.
Yeah. And I think part of that is the sort of the liberal premise of Trek, in that we want to, as I suppose Western citizens learn about other cultures, and sometimes that includes learning about the bad things that have happened or the bad things that our culture has perpetrated on those cultures. But I think it's also a function of the premise, the idea that the opportunities for recurring elements and enemies are going to be limited because they're just always on the move. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an essential part of a Voyager tale. There's a line from Chakotay in this episode where he says, quite angrily, why should anybody have to experience an atrocity that they didn't commit? And I know that he's emotional because of the circumstances, but I think the answer to that is clear, even in our own century. We don't have the technology to beam experiences into people's minds, but every memorial we construct, every survivor account, or the stories of victims from an event, they're all designed to do exactly that, force us to confront and in some ways relive a tragedy to prevent them from ever happening again.
I think in that moment, he's quite rightly feeling kind of violated by what's happened, because he's been forced to experience, as all the crew have, forced to experience these terrible, soul shrinking events that occurred, all these years earlier. Yeah. And he has a good point, because he didn't ask for that. He didn't come into it. He wasn't, permissions taken from him. And that's kind of the problem that's solved at the end of the story, is they realize that the memorial itself is not functioning. And what you should get is kind of like a terms and conditions before you get any of this stuff. Is, are you willing to perceive this? Are you willing to look at it? And you can imagine that the culture that built this thing would have done that, and so people would have come to see this thing and say, it's like if in the real world, if you ever visit the Holocaust Museum, before you go in, there is a kind of advisory saying, you are about to go and see stuff that is terrible and it may affect you deeply, and you need to think seriously about whether this is something you want to be exposed to. And the memorial should have that, but it doesn't. And that's how our characters are drawn into this mystery of why are we experiencing these things. And so Chakotay's reaction, I think, is an honest one. But at the same time, I think he sees the truth of what Janeway says, is that we don't have the right to turn this thing off, and to deny the purpose of it. Is, if anything, we'll fix it to make sure that it works correctly and that people can have the experience or choose not to as they see fit.
Yeah, I think that the parallels to the remembrance of the Holocaust and other events are clear. I still remember the chilling footage that they would show us of concentration camps when I was in school. And, it's horrifying, but I like that Janeway acknowledges and takes on that responsibility of, continuing, allowing the message to continue, obviously adding that disclaimer, but as being the ones that survive, having that responsibility to pass on the story, make sure that it never happens again. Something else that I find significant in the episode is that the civilization that created the monument is apparently gone. We don't see them anywhere. And Voyager doesn't take a lot of time to look into it because it hit the road. But apparently in 300 years, the Nakan have vanished, at least from this part of space, and we can only speculate as to why. And maybe the tensions and the conflicts that caused the tragedy that's being memorialized were symptomatic of a larger fatal problem in their society. Not only is the monument the marker of a tragedy, but it stands as sort of a cenotaph for the entire culture, at least for the crew of Voyager.
Yeah, I mean, because we don't, is the planet that we visit, is that actually a Nakan homeworld? I mean, I always had the sense that it wasn't, that it was like a colony or some world on the fringes rather than, the actual planet they originated. So, we don't know if the Nakan have, as you say, been consumed by whatever this conflict they had was, or have they left this area of space? Has some other tragedy occurred to them, or is it just that they turned up on a day that nobody's there? Maybe this is a pilgrimage site for them. Maybe people regularly come there, but our Voyager characters are there when no one else is around. So we don't know how that collects to the larger scope of the culture that created this device and left it there.
Yeah. I love these stories where characters get ideas or thoughts kind of beamed into their heads, and you always wonder about the sort of, well, I think it makes a point that like the general technological level of a culture doesn't necessarily there's peaks and valleys in there. So, if the Nakan were a colonizing species that maybe never got that far from their homeworld, their warp drives aren't that great. They do have like a technology that beams thoughts into your head, which seems kind of powerful, but maybe the human brain isn't as complicated as warp travel. When you look at something like the Inner Light, the whole struggle is that like this race can't get off this planet. They're all going to die on this planet because their sun is going nova, but they do have the ability to like put an entire 70 years of a man's life, into a beam that can be beamed into somebody's head. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
I've always liked stories where the characters question the nature of their reality, or where they're shown a different reality. I mean, Inner Light is a perfectly good example of that. Is that we see the entire synthetic sort of life that Picard lives, and it's like, was that a life of a real person? That is he like a recording of something that actually happened, or was it a kind of synthetic creation that's meant to suggest, an existence? It's a similar thing with the memories that you see in Memorial. Is that kind of like a Ken Burns documentary about like, okay, here's what we think happened during these events, and these are curated simulations of what we think occurs, or are the characters literally experiencing the memories of people who existed in that time period?
Yeah.
Certainly for me, when I was conceiving of the idea, that was my intention, is that the memories the Memorial projects are the real deal, So what you see in that moment, what you experience, that's what actually happened. It's not, somebody's idea, a second or third hand version of it.
Yeah. There's kind of a nod to that, I think, in scenes like when Harry is working in the Jeffries tube and he starts to have kind of a panic attack, and he sort of crawls on his belly to get out of this Jeffries tube. And it seems like a strange set of events, but later in the episode, when Harry and Tuvok go looking for the bodies of the people that he supposedly killed, and you realize, like, as they're crawling into this cave on their bellies, he was having that experience when crawling in the Jeffries tube. It's a really great parallel.
And I think the other idea that, again, this isn't something that really kind of is expressly shown in the story, but I like the concept that the Memorial would choose a memory that would dovetail with something in your own personal experience.
Yeah.
So perhaps there is something in Harry's life that he has, like your claustrophobia might have been something that he experienced, and so the Memorial picks something that would connect with him. So you would feel a personal connection to the events that take place on a very visceral level.
Yeah.
And thus, your experience of what this means becomes much more personal to you.
Yeah, they fit that really well for the entire crew. Like Chakotay finds himself in a role where he's carrying out and kind of questioning his superior's orders. Henry Kim, for all of his heroism, is young and scared, and he's sort of overwhelmed by the experience. And Neelix is focused specifically on the defenseless, the children, the wounded. And I also love that once Janeway begins experiencing it, she's presented with this question of responsibility, where they are trying to cover up what's happening. And as somebody who isn't the leader she doesn't have that role in the scenario, but she's still in a position of authority. She's like, whoa, no, you can't do this. Like, we have to, something happened here and people have to know about it. I love that idea that they, like you pointed out, like they are kind of both themselves, but also the roles, in the historical roles in the scenario as well.
Yeah, there's some parallel nature between the two of them. And I have to say, that scene with Janeway is my favorite scene in the entire episode.
Yeah.
Because I've always felt that Janeway, to me, is my favorite Star Trek captain is Kirk, but I've always felt that Janeway is very close in terms of kind of persona and kind of the sort of direction the character has. So I always felt like when she did the kind of what I would think of as the Kirkian kind of scenes is what I always felt. I really enjoyed the kind of character's performance. And I can remember saying to Brannon, I want a scene where Janeway says, "What gives you the right to do this?"
Yeah.
And that's the moment, and I always felt like Shatner does a great job of that when he nails those scenes in TOS. And I think that Kate Mulgrew comes through with a similar energy, but from a different place, but with equal amounts of energy and force behind it.
Yeah.
And that moment in Memorial when she calls him to task and she says, we murdered these people. How can we can't stand by and let this just fade away. You can't disintegrate the bodies and nobody will ever know it. This will not stand.
Yeah.
And I just absolutely love that moment because to me it feels like a pure Star Trek moment there.
Yeah. I love to hear you say that. I've often thought of Janeway, I think my favorite captain as kind of Kirk revisited or a Kirk 2.0, knowing now what we know in the modern era with modern sensibilities. And that is, it's a chilling scene, where they're just vaporizing these bodies. And it's a great stand-in for the way that governments or regimes try to cover up atrocities. And the reason that we need monuments and remembrance in the first place. It's something I've thought a lot about in relation to the Trek universe. Like somebody being vaporized when they're shot with a phaser or a disruptor. It's not anything new in Star Trek, but the implications of that are sweeping. What happens to habeas corpus? We see this played out in the episode. Somebody specifically using technology to erase the record of a crime. Murder in the future, it's obviously illegal, but totally destroying the evidence of a crime would have to carry a heavy penalty as well.
Yeah, there is something quite sinister about the idea that you could, if you have war with no bodies, it becomes clean, and if it becomes clean, it becomes easy.
Yeah.
And if it becomes easy, now you're on the road to, if you don't have to look at the body of somebody you killed, it becomes easier for you to kill the next person, and then you're going down a road that is eroding your moral core, And so these things it's a very sinister little idea that kind of is ticking away there at the heart of some of the technological ideas in Star Trek. Is how do you experience that and how do you guard against it?
Yeah, it reminds me of sometimes you'll see in a spy novel or a crime novel the idea of somebody committing a crime and then there being a witness, and the crime accelerates to murder because it's like I can't have this witness see what I did, so now I'm going to kill this person because of what I'm doing, and it's just sort of a similar thing. It reminds me of the fact that we are seeing in the episode, there's an element of the people who created the memorial are obviously the people who survived, that quote unquote won, so to speak, I guess. When I think about this episode in relation to Remember, that's an episode where the woman who's carrying these memories of these people that they killed, wants this idea to be heard because it's been sort of covered up and swept under the rug. But in Memorial, we're left with the mystery. We're left to wonder at the conflict in the Nakan society, and we're disconnected from any motivations. It's a senseless tragedy. But the monument forces you to relive specifically the role of the aggressors in the conflict. And you only by proxy sort of experience the pain and fear of the victims. So I wonder if that's sort of the perspective of the aggressors is something that they're presenting to sort of kind of chastise themselves and their role in what happened.
Yeah, I mean, the dark suggestion there is that nobody survived from the other group of people to tell their story.
Yeah. When you see like a memorial or Holocaust memorials or films based on that, you're often experiencing it from, the perspective of the undesirables that were, put to death in the Holocaust. And you rarely see like a Nazi perspective or a concentration camp guard perspective.
Yeah, because I mean, the inference here is that the Nakan were, as you say, the aggressors in this situation, and at some future point, they decided, this terrible atrocity has been committed, and we have to atone for that. And the memorial is not only them atoning as a society, but also saying to everybody who comes afterwards, like, come experience this, come see this terrible thing that we did, and we can know that we are better people now because we've got past that. But we must always remember what we've done because, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And the memorial is, it's not a theme park ride, right? It's not a movie. It's an experiential thing that, that you would go into this and be forever changed, quite likely.
Yeah. For that reason, I think the parallels in this are great as well to Vietnam War movies and Vietnam War fiction. Which are also seen often from the side of, American or Allied servicemen. It's a great parallel in that Vietnam is often described as the first war fought on television, where the public could see atrocities and violence and they weren't abstract. And Tom first starts experiencing the flashback when TV is introduced into his home. And TV and video is how we most often experience those kinds of tragedies, be it through film or documentary or the news.
Yeah, I mean, and that was definitely a touchstone. I can remember when the initial conversation I was having about this with Brian, is we talked about the My Lai massacre as like as a real world touchstone. And I talked about, my experience growing up in Europe with war memorials in every town and village for people who died in the First and Second World Wars. Part of the inspiration from this came from something that had fixed in my mind as a young child, is seeing the war memorial in my local hometown and going up to it and being afraid that I would see my own name etched on this list.
Wow.
And that somehow that that experience would be, as a kid, I was thinking that somebody just like me had been claimed by this war.
Yeah.
And that sort of idea, sort of struck me very deeply. And I think part of that, I definitely play out a little bit of that idea in this, because it is about the effect of something that a name on a war memorial has gone through. Each one of those names is a real person who's experienced an atrocity or has experienced warfare, has had these life-changing experiences happen to him in the course of war. And I think Memorial is the science fiction take on that, is saying, well, what if you went one step further? What if you literally walked a mile in the shoes of the people who went through this, and how would that change you?
Yeah, it's great to know that so much thought goes into the writing of just a single episode, and I think that My Lai parallel is clear. And the memorial reminds me a lot of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington as well. Although if the Vietnam Memorial mentally put you into apocalypse now, I'm not sure how that would be received.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, I can remember visiting Washington, D.C. and kind of doing the tours of the different memorials there. And it's the stark difference between the World War II memorial, the Korean War memorial, and then the Vietnam War memorial, is that, the differences between them show the differences in the people who were involved in those conflicts and the way that they reflected back into the society that we live in now.
Yeah. It's easy to forget that our characters in Star Trek are soldiers as well as scientists and explorers. And I think it's really significant that it's Neelix who's not only greatly affected by his experience with the memorial, but in the end, he's the one that's fully on board with keeping it going. He immediately steps up against Chakotay's protestations and the protestations of the bridge crew, and says, no, we have to keep this going. He's somebody who's seen atrocity in war firsthand, and he's not a soldier. He's not comfortable with the idea of acceptable loss or the idea that innocents die in war.
Yeah, I mean that's harking back to, is it Jetrel, the episode where
Yeah.
we learn a lot about like some of the darker past, that he's such a happy-go-lucky kind of character, and then we see that but he's come from a really dark place, and you can have to wonder, is the reason that he's such an upbeat guy is that he's pushing against the darkness that he's had in his life before that. So yeah, it feels to me 100% true to him that he would be there on the side of Janeway saying, no, we have to keep this thing going because the message it gives to the universe is just too important to be silenced.
Yeah. Throughout the episode, there is, I think, great depictions of the effects of PTSD, especially with Neelix. There's some occasions in Trek where we see our characters being deeply affected by the violence and stress of their jobs, but it's pretty sunny generally being a Starfleet officer. But the Memorial, in this instance, gives us a chance to see our characters reacting to the effects of violence and tragedy that we don't often see. When your friend and coworker is killed by an oil slick, or somebody gets turned into a crystal and crushed, we often just move on. But you have to imagine that the effects of being in Starfleet and also just facing the unknown and being in deep space has to have an effect that we sometimes edit out on Star Trek.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of quite out there. When some of the strange things, if you've been struck by lightning or killed by a reincarnated Greek god, right? It's like,
yeah,
that's I mean, it's still dead is dead, right? But it's still kind of, it seems very unusual. And then we see something like Memorial, or taken to its kind of more direct extreme. If you look at the Siege of AR 558, I think I've got the title correct, the Deep Space Nine episode, which is completely unflinching in its sort of depiction of what it's like to be on the front line in the trenches.
Yeah.
Where we see a kind of much harsher, kind of grittier view of what life and death is like in the Star Trek universe.
Yeah. Some of my favorite moments or episodes are times when they kind of dig into that. The fifth season episode, Night, where Voyager is trapped in this the void that they have to sort of cross, and they can't see any stars, and they're just literally confronted. It's a chance to get into the psyche of the Voyager crew and see how they really feel about being, 70,000 light years from home. And you've got Janeway just, like somebody in a quarantine, just locked up in her quarters, not talking to anybody, and just eating her own heart out over her decisions that she's made.
Yeah. I mean, because the Voyager crew are, the farthest men from home.
Yeah.
And although that kind of that idea kind of will gradually kind of fades away as the show goes forward, we do occasionally see it sort of pop up. And I think that emotional distance to me was always fascinating, and the idea that it was bubbling around underneath everything else that we're seeing.
Yeah.
You're on that ship for that long, a small vessel like that, you would eventually know everybody. It would be like a small town, right? Everybody, all their foibles, everything about them.
Yeah.
And what does that breed? That breeds contempt. It breeds tension.
Yeah.
and even the people with the better angels of their nature, it's difficult to live in a life like that.
Yeah.
And how would that express itself? And I think in some of the pitch meetings that Brian Fuller and I had, I remember we would talk about this kind of idealized dark Voyager, where we would joke about kind of what if we really kind of turned the dial up to 11 and went and took down the darker route. And it was like, we never get to tell these kind of stories.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thought experiment to sort of play that out, to ask those questions, and even just show a little kind of those darker shadings in these kind of stories.
Yeah, that's more the avenue of a Battlestar Galactica, where everybody's drinking themselves unconscious every night and fighting each other in boxing rings. But Trek, we still got work to do. We gotta save planets.
I think a little of that comes from my kind of innate British science fiction nihilism.
Sure.
Having been raised on a diet of shows like Blake 7, which was kind of one of the pretty much it looks like the Dirty Dozen in space with a bit of Robin Hood thrown in there, but it's actually quite grim and nihilistic.
Yes.
I think there's a little bit of me kind of shining through there. But at the same time, that's one of the things I love about Star Trek is you can embrace those two different poles, that you can say we're at the one end, things are dark and grim, but we're always striving and hoping to be better. That's one of the things that's at the core of Star Trek, is it's not about becoming perfect. It's about the journey towards that, and we're always constantly striving to be better, to step away from the dark towards the light.
Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah. They really let you know what you're watching in the first episode of Blake 7 when the oppressive regime frames Blake for child molestation or whatever. It's like, okay, all right, that's the kind of world that we're living in here.
Yeah, we're not going to see that on Star Trek.
Yeah, that's not going to be Star Trek.
I mean, even well, having said that, I mean, if we look at Picard is a darker show that does have like
sure,
and one of the things I like about it is it does challenge some of the sort of sacred cows of Star Trek. Is that the Federation and Starfleet is this infallible, perfect organization, and Picard says actually it isn't, and people can make bad decisions, and they can leave behind the hopes and dreams and the intentions of the founders of that organization and move in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And the question is, do you want to stick with that, or do you want to try and pull things back? And I love the fact that Star Trek's at a place in its life where we can explore that stuff, and it doesn't feel false. It feels true and authentic.
Yeah. It's a great idea, this idea that they are reliving this thing that never happened to them. But I do have technical questions about how it operates. And I guess since I've got one of the writers of the episode here, this would be a good time to explore those. It seems like, I'm not quite sure how it works exactly when you experience these emotions. The Delta Flyer went close to this planet. They were surveying this planet and probably experienced something and then flew back and forgot about what happened to them. Like, is it only happen, or do you only really experience it when you are within a certain range? And then once you leave that area, do those memories in time fade, or will they carry these memories with them forever?
I think the way I imagined it was that the memorial kind of inserts like a package of memories into your mind. So, if you're within its radius, it's you would be scanned in some fashion, and it would pick a package of memories that is kind of close to your personal
scenario. And 3 for you.
Yeah, there you go. So that's deposited in your mind, and then it would be how you or as a human or as whatever species you happen to be, right? How would you experience and process that information? Maybe to begin with, you'd have a couple of bad dreams until the intensity of it ramps up, and I guess the closer you get to it, the more intense that energy is, until you would experience as kind of like as a sort of waking vision, as a waking dream. Yeah.
I wonder if there would be an imperative then to. Because obviously you're close if you are experiencing, the effects or the signal, an imperative to get you to go to the memorial to see what it is, and that's kind of the end of the finale of the experience. There, I was just going to say really quick that I think this is a great showcase for the actors in this episode and the ensemble of Harry, Tom, and Neelix. And there's that scene in the briefing room where they're all sort of recovering their memories. We're getting an idea of what they're involved in, but we still don't know why. And the dialogue kind of does double duty because it fills us in on the situation, but the actors show how they're affected by what happened. And it made me wonder, were they sort of programmed by the monolith to establish the facts and the dramatic personae of the tragedy? Because obviously just, the nuts and bolts of doing TV, this is sort of like an info dump for us about what the scenario is. But when they all kind of get together, I wonder if, like, when you assemble people who have been affected by this, they unconsciously construct the story of what happened and the players involved for people who haven't been affected by the monolith. Like, this is where Janeway and other people who weren't there go, oh, okay, there's a narrative here of the Nakan and what's happened.
Yeah, that is another one of the great scenes where that scene starts off as one thing and it ends up becoming something completely different.
Yeah, they become totally consumed, like, emotionally by the recounting of this.
Yeah, and then for a moment there's kind of that moment where they lose themselves in it, and you can see the other characters who aren't connected to it yet going, well, what is happening here? What is happening to our friends? But there's also sort of, like you say, the narrative of it starts to unfold. It's almost like you remember those toys used to have a little chip in it, and the toy would say a line of dialogue, but if you had two toys, they would say two different lines of dialogue. And if you had like 3 or 4 of them, they would play out a little scene. And it's almost like the idea of each one of these characters has a piece of the jigsaw puzzle of this narrative. And once they lock together, it unlocks more.
Yeah.
So each one has a piece of the story, but once they're with another person, that other person's piece of a story unlocks more of their story.
Yeah.
And the narrative begins to interact, and it unfolds, and it becomes more of a living, breathing thing. Well, that's what it's all about presenting this as a living, breathing story for the people who go to see the memorial.
Yeah.
So that by the end of the experience, the idea is if you experience this correctly, this would be paced out, and you would know what you were experiencing. And I imagine it like a pilgrimage. As the closer you get, you would go through the intensity of this experience, and you would have this at the end of this kind of catharsis.
Yeah.
When you visit the memorial and you go, okay, now the experience is over, and now the understanding has been transmitted to you. Now you know what this is all about, and you can put it past you and assimilate it and learn from it, and then move on. But for our characters, because they're missing key parts of this process, to them, they kind of get it all in the wrong order.
Yeah, it's really frustrating to them.
It's frustrating and stressful and terrifying for them, because they don't know what they're experiencing until very late in the story.
That's such a cool sci-fi idea, and it's so cool that you can get even like a fraction of that like onto a weekly TV series. Obviously, if it was a novel, you could just you could really fill that out and explain what's happening there. But I think that comes across in a very suggestive way in the episode. And when they're like in character as the Nakan soldiers, they also seem to be like expressing or parroting the kind of emotions or opinions that the actual participants might have had. There's a lot of repetition of phrases like, we had no right to, they were unarmed, we had no choice. They're kind of like these conflicting expressions that don't let them off the hook necessarily, but they show that the perpetrators of the massacre were themselves, very conflicted and victimized by what happened.
Yeah, because there is the sense that the characters, as in the Voyager characters, but also the characters as in the characters we see in the flashback, everybody's kind of searching for the truth of this.
Yeah.
And unlike all things, where there are lots of participants, the truth is not from one point of view. It's a collective assemblage of different points of view. And it's about finding all the pieces. And at the end of the story, when they have all the pieces, they go, okay, this is what this is actually about. Now we understand.
Yeah.
But as I say, the early part of the story is they only have fragments of this, and they don't understand what they're experiencing. Is this some sort of attack? I mean, I love the initial idea is that the characters are even thinking, did we actually do this? Is this something? Right. Is this? They don't even realize early on that it's somebody else's memories. You start to think, is this me? Did I do this terrible thing?
Yeah.
There's in the tunnel and shooting on these unarmed people, and you can imagine somebody he's a nice guy, he's a deeply sensitive person, and then he's going through this experience asking himself, what if I actually did this and this information's been erased from me? Because we've seen that in Star Trek before. We've seen characters having an experience and that experience is erased because for whatever reason, aliens don't want you to know that we lived on that planet, or this traumatic thing happened to you and we're trying to protect you by deleting that memory.
Yeah.
But here I can just thinking, what if I actually did something terrible? And especially the thing that takes place, the tragedy that takes place in the story, is so against the kind of morals and choices that our Starfleet characters go for. They would never do something like this. And to think, what if I did? That's such a traumatic experience.
I think Janeway is great as always in this episode. I love that she's willing to believe her officers. She's even having a little fun until some of the few light points in the episode until the visions hit her as well. And her pure disgust over what Savdra ends up doing on the battlefield and her powerlessness to stop it is great acting by Kate Mulgrew. I also like when she's touring all the affected crew members on her own ship as they're getting closer to the memorial, and she takes the time to talk with that one ensign to comfort him. That's not something that needed to be included in the script, but I'm glad it's there. I think it's clearly meant to contrast the brutality of the Nakan soldiers, but it's a really nice moment.
Yeah, that's very much a moment where you see that the idea of Voyager as a family, and that she is this mother leader figure, and it's you wonder if a different captain might not have kind of carried that scene with the same emotional weight that she does.
Yeah, the Patton scene where he just slaps the guy and he's like, come on, get back to work.
Yeah, it's the absolute of that, isn't it?
Yeah. Seven's interaction with Neelix is so great too. Seven's, barely in the episode. And I think on another day, this could have been chiefly a Seven episode. A scenario like her cortical implant picks up the signal from the monument, and she starts reliving this. But instead, she's employed solely to tweak the audience a little bit. Just in case you're not getting the message just yet, they really make it clear, when she talks about how it's important that we wield our guilt as a tool that we remember specifically to prevent the next atrocity.
I mean, Seven's a difficult fit in this episode because of who she is.
Yeah.
Because she is someone who has committed atrocities. Yeah. And we have seen, in other stories where she takes that on the chin and she admits that, I've done terrible things because I was part of the board collective. And of course, the question about like, well, how much agency did she have in those things? That's a whole other conversation.
Sure.
But she's in a different position from the other characters because she's experienced terrible things, she's better equipped to deal with it. Whereas our kind of morally upstanding Starfleet characters who would never in a million years, hopefully, do the kind of stuff that the are not equipped to deal with the intense sort of emotional pressure and the trauma that comes from these events. And I think if we experienced it through Seven's eyes, I think maybe some of the emotional power of the story would have been robbed. It's better that our characters who are a little bit more naive in those kind of terms. Certainly, Harry is always plays the sort of as the naif kind of character. The guy who's the upbeat, nice, friendly guy. Who's not really going to be in this kind of situation, and he's pushed into doing this terrible thing, and he thinks he's experienced it. And have I experienced it? Did I do this? The journey that Harry goes on through the story. I don't think it would have had the same power if it would have been Seven going through that narrative.
Yeah. Instead, she's sort of set apart as the kind of first time kind of character, the character with experience with this situation.
Almost the kind of Greek chorus in this story.
Yeah, absolutely.
She is the one kind of like saying, well, this is how this kind of stuff plays out. This is what it means to experience these sort of traumas.
Yeah. Eat your souffle. Yeah. As we wrap up here, I was just curious, do you ultimately agree with Janeway's choice to keep the memorial going? Oh,
absolutely. I think I can completely understand like Chakotay's sort of experience of coming through this and going, this traumatized me and we don't want this to happen to other people. Yeah. And I think Janeway, absolutely understands that that's right. But it's silencing the memorial silences everything about it. It silences the trauma that the people who really experienced this went through. And it means that, that also they would be switching off a part of a culture that they're not even involved with. As we said, we don't know what the status of the Nakan is, but what right do you have to say to the Nakan, you cannot experience this memorial anymore. You cannot experience this event.
Yeah.
It's unfair to do any of that. She does the next best thing she can, which is, well, we're going to try and fix this thing and we're going to put a buoy in orbit saying you better be careful if you come too close, you're going to have this experience.
Yeah.
And she kind of, like I said at the beginning, she reinstates the terms and conditions.
Yeah, right. Right.
Like, do you accept? Please click this box. Well, then, okay, if you proceed past this point, this is what's going to happen to you.
Yeah, that's kind of the Federation's whole thing, their line, too. Like, she introduces that synthesis of clearly the Nakan, this was important and they want you to know about this, but also she introduces that idea of consent and body sovereignty where it's like, we want you, we think that this is an important expression, but people, need to have the option to have it as well. And I think that's what the Federation's all about.
Yeah. So ultimately, the choice remains, if you want to, you can imagine maybe there might be somebody in the can saying like, well, that never happened. I don't believe it. I'm a denier of the events.
Yeah.
And that person has the right to say that. And it's the Starfleet Federation way. It's like, you have the right to choose your level of involvement with this, but it shouldn't be forced upon you.
Well, at the end of the show, we usually talk about my space dad can beat up your space dad. Who's your favorite captain and why? And you said that your favorite captain was Kirk. And I was wondering how you think he might have handled this situation differently.
Wow, that's a good question. I'd never thought of that.
He loves talking computers to death. He loves shutting computers and systems down. I wonder if he might have made a different choice.
Yeah, I think Kirk would have probably pulled the plug. I think that final conversation, if we reframe this as a TOS story,
the
thing about the original series is I always said that Kirk, Spock, McCoy are three aspects of the same personality. The reason they work so well is that Spock is the coolly logical, rational. McCoy is the visceral, energetic, human, and Kirk is the kind of synthesis of the two, trying to find a path that kind of pulls from both directions.
Yeah,
you can imagine McCoy's reaction to this would be the visceral, emotional sort of. He would be traumatized by what's happening, but I think McCoy would also say there's a reason that this thing should stay around because it tells us an important message. And I think that Spock would also kind of lead to that viewpoint, is that this is, do we have the right to turn this off?
Right.
I think Kirk would be conflicted, but I think he would probably come down on the pulling the plug option.
Yeah, just pulling the plug, feeling bad about it, saying something about how time consumes all of us, and then just flying off at the end.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think Kirk would sort of, he'd leave a note. Sorry we turned your machine off, but
yeah.
but it was traumatizing all of our crew members, and we're not going to have that.
Yeah,
because I think Kirk would be more concerned about the fact that I don't want my crew or anybody else's crew running into this thing.
Yeah.
And I think he would be more likely to say, let's just, rather than saying to people, well, you can experience it if you want to. I think Kirk would say, let's just pull the plug. That'd be safer.
Yeah, and I think it reflects probably the ideas of exploring other cultures and multiculturality in the 60s versus the 90s and the 2000s, where the 60s would be like, well, that's too bad, things like that happen. But the 90s or 2000s is more of, well, this is bad, but let's learn about this. Let's make other people know about this. I guess I wonder, like, if we did that today, like if this was something on Picard, like how the crew or the captain would act in this situation.
I think Picard would go off and find in a can. I think he would
just trace it down to the source.
Yeah, I think he'd. I can imagine Picard going off to find in the can and saying, we experienced this. By the way, go fix your memorial because you're messing with people's heads.
Yeah.
But he'd say that, but he'd be respectful about it, right? He'd say, like,
sure, yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity to learn from this teaching moment that but you guys should really do something about that.
Yeah.
So maybe fix it. I think that would be the. I mean, I wonder. I don't know how Picard would deal with it as a younger Picard, like kind of TNG era Picard. I'm thinking of like the older sort of Picard where I'm saying that. I wonder how that would play out.
Yeah, I think he might have turned it off as well, younger Picard.
Yeah, maybe kind of first season TNG Picard. Yeah, I can see him maybe going, this thing is not good for people.
Yeah, it's a tragedy, but it's Well, now that we've reached the end of the show, you'll receive a commission at the rank of Lieutenant Junior grade. What department on the ship do you work in?
Well, I'd probably want to be in operations because it means I get to fly the ship.
Yeah, sure. I'd have to wonder, you think about Top Gun and fighter pilots, and I feel the need for speed. And when you're so removed from what you're doing, even from the physics of what you're doing, I wonder if it's fun to fly a Federation vessel or if it's just kind of like typing, the person with the highest words per minute is their best pilot.
I have to say, when Voyager was being filmed, I did have the opportunity to kind of sit in every chair on the bridge.
Oh, that's great.
And Tom Paris's chair, if you've ever seen it, it's on a kind of sliding rail.
Yeah.
It goes from chair goes left, chair goes right, chair goes left, chair goes right, and I sat in Tom Paris's chair, and that was the one I liked the most. Because I just rested my hands on it and I felt like, I could fly this thing. I enjoyed it.
A wide command of all these systems.
But it is like, I think, the point that you just made there about how it does feel like typing. I mean, I think that's why Tom Paris built the Delta Flyer with a joystick, right?
Yes.
Because he's obviously someone who harks back to that and he wants a little bit of that sort of tactility in his controls. So, so he's got like kind of like, throttle and stick and flicky switches and dials and what have you. I think he's got some of that going.
I wonder if it's the influence of like military fiction in the years since the 60s, Star Trek, the original series, or like video games. But it does seem like they want to introduce that tactile, kinetic feeling back in. You got the scene in Insurrection where Riker gets his little Logitech joystick to move the Enterprise around, or even the scenes in the recent season of Discovery or Picard where they're flying under things and over things, and the cat's falling off the control console and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and we've got the sort of the programmable matter, so it actually feels like, rather than just being a touch-sensitive screen, it's like, little, it's you can imagine it's popping up under your hand, so you feel like you're actually touching buttons and pressing stuff.
Yeah, and the ship itself is sort of reconfiguring into different streamlined configurations.
I mean, we see a lot now in sci-fi of this what I always think of as the kind of the Minority Report in a haptic interface, right? Which is the holographic panels floating in front of your face, and you can reach in there and you can pinch zoom like you do on your iPhone.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And move apps and icons around. And I think that's obviously a reaction to the real world technology that we're using.
Yeah.
But to be honest, I'm firmly in the kind of like, I'm in the cockpit with Maverick and Goose, right? I mean, I'm the guy. If I was flying a spaceship, I would want throttle and stick. I would want the feel of like a yoke or a joystick or a throttle control,
sure,
or some flicky switch buttons. It's much more the Battlestar Galactica Viper or the X-Wing or Serenity. The control systems on those, I think, speak to me a lot more than kind of just a touch sensitive screen.
Yeah, that's actually talks to you.
Yeah.
Well, Lieutenant Swallow, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can at EISTpod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
If you're interested in learning more about me and my writing, my Star Trek work, my Mark Twain novels, or pretty much anything that I've done, please come along and find me at my website, which is jswallow.com. And if you have any questions or you just want to see me posting interesting pictures of stuff I like, you can find me on Twitter, and that's at JMSwallow.
And your novel, The Dark Veil, is out now. I'll have a link in the show notes where people can check that out. Also, we should be looking for the paperback release of Rogue and the U.S. release of Shadow coming soon. And where can people get those? You
will be able to pick up Shadow from Tor Forge Books. And my Mark Twain books here in the UK are published by Bonnier Zafra. And all of my Star Trek fiction is available from Simon & Schuster.
All right. And I'll get links to those in our show notes as well. Thanks again for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always fun to come and talk Star Trek.
Thanks again. We are signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.